Okay, so we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 8th lecture in a series of lectures organized as part of the Visegrad project entitled Analytic Philosophy in Visegrad Countries. The project is funded by the International Visegrad Fund, which made it possible for us to organize this lecture as well, and we are grateful to the fund for that. Before introducing today's speaker and lecture, I would like to briefly mention what our Visegrad project is about. The main objective of the project is to promote analytic philosophy as developed or still developing in the Visegrad region. To this end, we are organizing 3 workshops, one of which was devoted to the logic in the Visegrad countries and has already taken place in Ostrava, Czech Republic in September 2025. The second workshop focused on the philosophy of science in the Visegrad region and took place in January this year in Banská Bystrica, Slovakia. And the third workshop focuses on philosophy and language in the Visegrad countries and will take place this September in Warsaw, Poland. In addition to these workshops, we will produce 10 audio podcasts, and we are also organizing a series of 9 online lectures, the 8th of which is taking place right now. So let me briefly now introduce today's lecture and the speaker. Our today's lecturer is Juraj Halas from the Department of Logic and the Methodology of Science, Faculty of Arts, Comenius University in Bratislava, Slovakia. His research interests focus on general philosophy of science, philosophy of social science, philosophy of economics, Marx, critique of political economy, history of Marxism, and history of philosophy of science in Slovakia, and much more besides. Juraj has published several papers on methods of idealization and abstraction in philosophy of science. Some of his papers focus on selected methodological conceptions of science from Slovakia, such as the theory of Václav Černík, for instance. Currently, Juraj is involved in a research project on the semantics of conditionals. So his online lecture today, entitled The Origins and Vicissitudes of Philosophy of Science in Slovakia, traces the history of philosophy and methodology of science in Slovakia during the 20th century. The most important events and twists in this story, however, will tell you Juraj, so I will hand it over to him now, but I have one more request. Please mute your microphones while Juraj is giving his lecture. Thank you. And now, please, Juraj, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Milos. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. Thank you, Milos, for the very kind introduction. I also want to thank the organizers of this lecture series for inviting me to present on the history of philosophy of science in Slovakia, which is a topic on which there is not a lot of material available in languages other than Slovak for obvious reasons. My own research into this topic was motivated in part by personal reasons, I would say. My older colleagues at the Department of Logic and Methodology of Sciences here at Comenius University were themselves part of this history, not least because they were former students or academic descendants of the founding fathers of logic and philosophy of science in Slovakia. So through stories and anecdotes that were told at department meetings and various informal gatherings, I slowly began to piece together this rather complicated and checkered history of logic and philosophy of science and analytic philosophy more broadly in this country. I have to say I pursued this interest on and off, also by looking at some existing accounts of this history that were published in the 90s or early 2000s. And then also by reading some of the original works, which range from the mid-1930s to the late 1980s. And so in today's presentation, I want to just give a very, very broad overview of this history. My presentation viewer is jumping around, so let me go to the beginning. A very broad overview of this history and focus on some key moments in this story. As we will see, they will be moments both high and low. So I will start by discussing the pre-World War II origins, which basically introduced logical empiricism to Slovakia. However, this promising period of discoveries and new directions was followed by basically a politically induced decline in the 1950s, after which philosophy of science had to recover in new and rather limiting conditions. However, it did recover, and it reached another peak in roughly the 1968 to 1970 period. But after that, for well-known reasons, progress was again complicated by political factors, even though work in the field continued in as much as it could. So I would say my talk is a contribution to the history of analytic philosophy in V4 countries, because Slovakia is one of them, in that it shows that this history includes not just great achievements of, I'm sure there are many, but also quite a bit of unrealized potential or false starts and many thwarted hopes, I guess. I should also preface what I'm going to say by clearly stating that I'm not going to deal with perhaps the most famous analytic philosopher with some ties to Slovakia, whose work would also be very topically relevant, because his book, which is called The Structure of Science, probably his main work from 1961, is widely considered a classic in the philosophy of science. But unfortunately for Slovak history of philosophy, this philosopher's ties to Slovakia are very tenuous. Ernst Nagel was born to Jewish parents in 1901 in what is today Nové Mesto nad Váhom, in the western part of Slovakia. But the family emigrated to the US when Nagel was still a child. And once he was in the US, he went to Columbia University, was one of John Dewey's grad students. And then he went on to become one of the few philosophers in general that were inducted to the US National Academy of Sciences. As far as we know, he never returned to Slovakia. So, of course, it would be preposterous to claim him for this Slovak history of philosophy of science. But I mention him not because I think that he should be viewed as part of this history, but because I wanted to point out this historical connection. Well, another connection concerning Nagel is that in the 1930s, he traveled to Europe, and he produced this quite famous two-part report on analytic philosophy in Europe. He came here on a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he visited Cambridge, Vienna, but also some V4 countries. He went to Warsaw, Lviv, and to Prague. This report was published in the Journal of Philosophy, and it basically served to introduce some more recent developments in analytic philosophy to the American academic audience. At around the same time, another Slovak-born philosopher was also hard at work, trying to introduce these ideas to the Slovak audience. In 1934, he visited the 8th International Congress of Philosophy, which took place in Prague. This Congress was very well attended, so people like Schlick, Neurath, and Carnap were all in attendance. You can see the photo here is from the Czech or Czechoslovak parliament, which is where the Congress was taking place, and none other than Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk was also speaking at the Congress. By the way, Nagel was also present, and he was giving a talk, but we don't know if this other Slovak philosopher I am talking about was able to actually meet Nagel while he was there. So who was this other Slovak philosopher that was attending? It was Igor Hrušovský, who was born in 1907 in Banovce nad Bebravou, which is just about an hour from where Nagel was born, a little bit earlier. But unlike Nagel, Hrušovský would remain in Czechoslovakia for the rest of his life, apart from some short visits to Britain, for example. We don't know the exact year when Hrušovský was first exposed to logical empiricism, but what we can say is that in the period roughly between 1935 and 48, he pretty much single-handedly introduced logical empiricism to Slovakia. He also produced the first book on the philosophy of science written in Slovak. And he basically laid the terminological and theoretical foundations for any further work in the area in Slovakia. He would also later become an important teacher to the next generation or generation and a half of philosophers working in both in logic and in philosophy of science. So in what follows, I will first focus on these origins, this early work by Hrušovský. Basically, the origins of philosophy of science, like I said, overlap with Hrušovský's early achievements. And I will then turn to the vicissitudes or complications in which Hrušovský also played a key part, as we will see on both sides, so to speak. So Hrušovský was trained in biology. He graduated from Charles University in 1930, but he then went back to Bratislava to pursue philosophy. And he published his dissertation, which was called Inventiveness and Evolution, sometimes also translated as Invention and Development, which I think has a slightly different meaning, in 1935. The official philosophical environment at the time in Bratislava was centered around Comenius University, which was only founded in 1919, so at that time a very young university, one could say. And broadly speaking, there were two important currents in Slovak philosophical thought at the time. One was traditional positivism, represented mostly by Czech professors who were in charge of the philosophy department, the most prominent of whom was Josef Tvrdý. And the other tendency or other trend in Slovak philosophy at the time was Catholic philosophy, first of the neo-Thomist variety and then later Blondelism, which was this specific religious philosophical tendency founded by Maurice Blondel. However, by the mid-1930s, a new generation of Slovak intellectuals was being formed, which was sort of discontent with the existing intellectual atmosphere, and it was eager for new cutting-edge approaches. And among those that were in circulation, that were around, so to speak, were the following: new directions in aesthetic theory and art criticism, where the Prague linguistic structuralism played an important role. Psychology of the unconscious, also centered in Vienna to a large part. Marxism, obviously, and logical empiricism of the Vienna Circle. So this was a decidedly modernist generation of intellectuals. Later, they would be called the avant-garde 38, based on the year, which was very much opposed to conservative thought, conservative obscurantism, as they called it, and also to the coming war, which I guess was already in the air. And so they aligned themselves with what they saw as the forces of progress, which was for them avant-garde art, breakthroughs in both natural and social science, and also socialist politics. And Igor Hrušovský was part of this intellectual scene, one could say. And already in his philosophical dissertation, Inventiveness and Evolution, he engages with logical empiricism, although in a slightly eclectic way. The book's main concern is the problem of what Hrušovský calls inventive creativity in different areas, so in biology, in psychology, and in sociology. And his central argument proceeds from biology. He's very much inspired by this now forgotten biologist called Hans Driesch, who was also interested in philosophical question and defended a certain kind of vitalism, according to which biological phenomena are governed by specific laws which are not reducible to physics or chemistry. And Hrušovský took this up and claimed that the social domain also inherits this holistic character. And in an argument that was later described as inspired by Neurath, Hrušovský claims that the social interests must take priority over individual interests, and on this basis he argues for basically a socialist organization of society. I reference below a recent paper by my compatriot Juraj, who is now in Prague. This is, I think, the only paper on Hrušovský available in English, and it deals with this early work. And especially with the connection to Dries, I very much recommend it to anyone interested in Hrušovský's early thought. In methodological terms, the work exhibits a strange combination of both Vienna Circle, logical empiricism, anti-reductionism taken from Dries, and a broadly socialist political orientation that would also be evident in Hrušovský's later writings. So this was his first use of logical empiricism. This interest in Vienna Circle philosophy would intensify in the following years, also through meetings with Philipp Frank, who at that time was in Prague, I think, or maybe it was Vienna, I'm not quite sure, but Frank, as Hrušovský would remember later, would travel to Bratislava, and they would meet in a cafe called Berlin, depicted here on an old postcard. So this young generation, discontent with the existing intellectual environment of Slovakia, banded together and founded what was called the Association for Scientific Synthesis. This was a group of academics, basically, both at university and outside it, who were directly inspired by the Vienna Circle, as you can see in the quotation from their manifesto, which was published in 1938. And their goal was to organize scientific efforts in a collective, collaborative way, while also making sense of some basic principles on which particular disciplines are based. And they would organize lectures on specific topics from philosophy, ethnology, history, literary theory. And Hrušovský held a number of lectures for the association, and they would also appear in the press. And these were the first publications in Slovak to basically explain the philosophy of logical empiricism in a more rigorous way to the Slovak readership or audience, and the first publications to introduce the ideas of Schlick, Carnap, Neurath, and others to Slovak readers. It seems that despite this open admission in the manifesto that they are inspired by the Vienna Circle, it looks like Hrušovský was the only one who really pursued any kind of philosophical work in this direction. Still, it was accepted within the association as a regular part of the Avant-Garde 38. And interestingly, Hrušovský's article on Carnap, entitled Rudolf Carnap and Logical Syntax, appears in a collection that was published in 1938, which is called Áno a nie, or Yes and No, which is usually viewed as the first public collective appearance of Slovak surrealism, which in Slovak was called nadrealismus. So in a strange kind of coincidence, logical empiricism and surrealism entered the Slovak intellectual and cultural scene hand in hand in 1938. So Hrušovský would continue his work beyond these lectures, and in 1941 he publishes his first major work, I would say, Teória vedy, or the Theory of Science, which was developed from these earlier lectures and articles. It is the first book-length treatment of philosophy of science in Slovak, and for its time it was remarkably current with recent developments in the field of philosophy of science. So in its core argumentation, the work is a rather faithful reception of Vienna Circle logical empiricism circa 1935, 1937. It opens with a historical reconstruction of the debate between rationalism and empiricism in the history of philosophy. Hrušovský resolves this debate using the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. He views logical and mathematical propositions as tautological, while empirical propositions are synthetic and a posteriori, and therefore inherently hypothetical. So philosophy, if it is to be scientific, it must be the logical analysis of the language of science. That means its syntax and semantics. The central methodological innovation, I guess, is a dual framework of verification. So Hrušovský distinguishes between syntactic verification, which is basically checking for logical consistency within a linguistic framework. And this kind of verification yields apodictic certainty, as Hrušovský terms it, and semantic verification, which is checking for adequacy against actual factual material, and it yields only probable or probabilistic results. So according to Hrušovský, all empirical propositions are hypothetical. Verification is always incomplete. He basically uses the term verification to mean confirmation, but he uses both terms, but sometimes when he means to say confirmation, he says verification. So the book has a broadly Carnapian framework, but it departs from the Vienna Circle mainstream from these core tenets of the Vienna Circle in three respects, which would continue to be important in Hrušovský's later work. And that would be, he defends causal determinism. He defends a form of moderate scientific realism. And one can still see traces of this vitalist influence by Driesch, in that Hrušovský uses the term entelechy to basically refer to this non-energetic factor that governs biological phenomena and cannot be reduced to physical or chemical factors. So Hrušovský's interest places him quite close, I would say, to Otto Neurath. The article I mentioned by Hvorecký also argues for this, because Hrušovský wants to extend the scientific method to social science. So similarly to Neurath, for whom the development of social science and a physicalistic sociology was also an important concern. He also defends the irreducibility of particular domains. So biology is not reducible to physics, sociology is not reducible to biology, etc. And he also views the ideal of the unity of science as not being based on a common physicalist language, but more on coordination of methods across disciplines. In the book, he also discusses the protocol statements debate and basically takes Neurath's position. So apparently Neurath was a key influence. On the other hand, a visible absence in the book is any engagement with Popper. So he does cite the logic of scientific discovery, but he doesn't seem to notice the important differences between Popper and the Vienna Circle. He also views Popper as part of the Vienna Circle, which is not quite correct. So he doesn't notice the asymmetry between verification and falsification, or Popper's views on the problem of induction, etc. Hrušovský at the time basically remains within the confirmationist framework a la Carnap. So the book's main significance, I think, lies in that it was the first book-length treatment of philosophy of science, like I said, and it also established what was basically a fully developed Slovak vocabulary for the philosophy of science, creating a bridge, so to speak, between intellectual life in Slovakia and what were then the most advanced international currents of that period in the philosophy of science. The book that Hrušovský later viewed as his most important, however, is his next book, published shortly after the Second World War, which was called Problémy noetiky, or Problems of Epistemology, which came out in 1948, but was obviously written shortly before that. The focus here shifts from philosophy of science narrowly construed to epistemology. And also, while the early work from 1941, Theory of Science, drew almost exclusively on German language sources, pre-war Vienna Circle writings, Problems of Epistemology also engage with recent Anglo-American logical empiricism and analytic philosophy more broadly. So we can see that Hrušovský was well versed in Ayer's writings. He cites Russell. He cites Carnap's later work in the U.S. Or Hempel's studies in the logic of confirmation. By the way, also featured in the book is Nagel, Ernst Nagel, but we don't know if Hrušovský at the time was aware of his origins. So what the book does is basically it consolidates these earlier views and clarifies the approach to confirmationism that Hrušovský already holds in the Theory of Science. So he completely rejects total verification, as he calls it. No empirical proposition can be verified exhaustively. Empirical testing begins from hypotheses, which are the product of invention, which is viewed basically as a psychological process, which is outside the purview of philosophy of science or epistemology. And then from these hypotheses, we proceed to deductive consequences that are compared with observational results. With the accumulation of positive results of these tests, the degree of probability or degree of confirmation of the hypothesis increases. So he still uses the term verification to basically say confirmation, but apart from that, it's basically a standard confirmationist model. He also develops a position that was implicit already in Theory of Science, that even the most elementary empirical propositions, like protocol statements, are shaped by prevailing theoretical structure. So the distinction between observation and theory is just a distinction of degree, but not of kind. We could see in this an anticipation of post-positivist views that would later be discussed in Western philosophy of science. Hrušovský also defends with something which looks like a version of confirmational holism. So empirical testing does not target isolated propositions, but whole complexes of propositions like theories. So the outcome of an empirical test has consequences for the whole system. However, these insights are present in the book, I would say, in embryonic form. Hrušovský was trying to catch up to the most recent developments and successfully produced something like a coherent reformulation of what happened on the terrain of philosophy of science from roughly 1940 to 46. And these anticipating insights that are present, like confirmational holism or a version of theory-ladenness, are only stated, but not really defended in a rigorous way. It would probably require additional work and also maybe some confrontation with peers, of which there were none at the time in Slovakia. This is important to say that Hrušovský was basically alone in this kind of work. So this would probably be required to develop these insights into something more coherent. Unfortunately, as you can see from the date of publication, the book came out in 1948. The events that took place shortly after that or during that year prevented any kind of international confrontation or collaboration with philosophy of science in the West. The coming of power of the Communist Party in February 48 basically installed Marxism-Leninism as the mandatory philosophical framework, and this transformation of the whole intellectual landscape or culture meant that publishing books like this was no longer possible, because they freely engaged with logical empiricist sources, were also sympathetic to them, and even tried to combine logical empiricism with certain Marxism-inspired or Marxist positions. So all of this had dire consequences for Hrušovský's approach to philosophy, which could no longer be developed in these conditions, and also for his own career, which in the 1950s took an entirely different and maybe somewhat surprising turn. I think the best representation of this is this 1955 book called Philosophy of Science. The contrast with these earlier publications, either The Theory of Science or Problems of Epistemology, is very stark. So the book, this 1955 book, emphasizes partisanship, or stranickost, as we would say in Slovakia, as basically the overriding principle in deciding theoretical debates, and proposes a very rigid framework based around dialectical materialism as it was interpreted in the 1950s. It quotes Stalin and Zhdanov as philosophical authorities. It takes the side of Lysenko against Darwin. I mean, it's nearly a total abdication of the views that were expounded in The Theory of Science and Problems of Epistemology. Later on, Hrušovský would reflect on this period with a sense of deep bitterness. So in 65, in a collection of writings, he says, as far as my own philosophical activity is concerned in the 1950s, though my early work was viewed around 1950 as marred by objectivism or academism, which were the official labels applied, I believe my later work done in the 1950s would certainly have benefited from being more influenced by these features, right? So Hrušovský, along with some others, became the target of an institutional attack as being influenced by objectivism and academism. And here he basically says, well, maybe a bit more of objectivism and academism in my 1950s work would have done them good. There's also a very telling jab at his critics that he makes in 1956, where he says, some of our philosophers vigorously opposed positivism. However, in their writings, these deniers of the coherence theory of truth applied almost exclusively this very theory. It was enough for them if their conclusions were compatible with quotations from the classics, by which the obvious authors are meant, themselves often torn out of context to suit the purposes that were set out. So as you can see, already in 1956, something seems to be changing, if it was possible to publish this kind of criticism of his critics. Before we turn to this new period that starts after the death of Stalin and the revelations of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, I want to mention Hrušovský's own role during the 1950s, because his position as regards Marxism-Leninism and the 1950s heroic period of Stalinism in Czechoslovakia is somewhat contradictory. So he held a number of high positions. Already in 1946, he becomes the director of the Institute of Philosophy at the Academy of Sciences. He will remain the director until 1959. During the same period, he was also the head of the Department of History of Philosophy at Comenius University. again, for a very long time. Between 1950 and 1953, I think he was director of the university. And he was also the chair of the social sciences section of the of the Academy of Sciences. So I don't think we would find anyone else occupying so many key positions in the social science institutional hierarchy within a single lifetime, not to mention at the same time as Hrušovský did. Also, his affinity with Marxism, which I've already hinted at when I was talking about these early works before the Second World War, it seems that for him this wasn't as in many other cases, just a kind of opportunistic career choice, nor was it a purely intellectual salon matter. And I don't think it was just the result of outside pressure, right? As in many cases it was. So I've already noted his familiarity with Marxist theory that is already apparent in his early works. So already his philosophical dissertation cites Lenin, for example, or Bukharin. And in the following years, he kept this interest. So it is also evident from the theory of science, where the first chapter is basically a presentation of like a sociological theory of scientific progress, which is very clearly inspired by Marxism. Also in 1945, so long before there's any political change, Hrušovský writes a foreword, a preface to a little brochure, which was the first volume of the so-called Library of Marxism-Leninism, which was a series of brochures by classics, by all kinds of authors, but classics of Marxism-Leninism that would be republished in many editions. So this first volume of the Library of Marxism-Leninism was put out in 20,000 copies, and Hrušovský wrote the preface, and it was this one. It was Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism, the very work that would, in just a few years, serve as not just a template, but also as an iron cage for philosophical thought in the 1950s. And you can compare the quotation from Hrušovský's foreword or preface with his views on confirmation that I mentioned earlier. So clearly a great departure from his earlier views. So I've already hinted at this revival that would take place for reasons which are very well known. The 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 56 came with these revelations about the cult of personality and departures from certain norms that were to be avoided in the future, and this led to a certain kind of loosening of screws in not just the USSR but also slightly later on in the Eastern Bloc. So, of course, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia maintained its grip on power, but still at least a little bit of space opened up for developing some ideas that went beyond the orthodoxy that was enforced very vigorously in the 1950s. So, except for a very brief period that I will get to later, even though there was this space, we have to remember that this space was still very much constrained by Marxism-Leninism as the operative framework for everything. So critical discussion and new ideas, this was possible on the terrain of Marxism-Leninism, which one had to meet certain requirements, such as engaging with the classics, having the right number of quotations, reflecting on some developments in Soviet philosophy, reproducing certain agreed upon criticisms of bourgeois philosophy, etc. So this slow but steady revival of philosophy of science took place on this terrain, and it was it was basically a revival of Marxist-Leninist methodology and philosophy of science. It's important we understand that when looking at these later works. I think one factor that seemed to have contributed to this revival, also in logic, but in philosophy of science as well, was the idea of the upcoming scientific technological revolution, as it was officially termed during that time. So by the early 60s, it was becoming quite clear that the economic model that was based around administrative planning and very much focused on extensive growth, heavy industry, etc. This model was clearly exhausted, and some change towards increased efficiency, increased productivity, etc. was needed. And there's a very clear shift across Czechoslovak intellectual culture as a whole, as scientific progress becomes like this new hope, the central hope for any future development, not just economic, but social development in general. So this can also be seen on for example, on the change of attitudes towards cybernetics or systems theory. So these went from being called a bourgeois pseudoscience to basically a buzzword that was omnipresent across disciplines. Although it was a buzzword, it appears to have provided some real assistance in strengthening the position of so-called formal logic, as it was then called, and to some extent protected it from political interference. And I think something like that also happened with methodology or philosophy of science. So before I turn to this revival, I want to mention one more episode from the late 1950s, which I think quite well illustrates the fragility or instability of this revival, and it involves Hrušovský personally, because in 1957, and this has only been revealed quite recently from the archives. In 1957, he became a person of interest for state security in an investigation into a group of suspected Trotskyists, who included some of his friends from the 1930s. So some of the people involved in this artistic literary avant-garde in the 1930s were, at the end of the 50s, they were investigated on trumped-up charges for being so-called Trotskyists. Some of them would actually be convicted to prison terms. And Hrušovský, because he was somehow associated with them, was part of this investigation. I mean, fortunately for him, nothing came out of it, but it's a good reminder that his past as a logical empiricist with an affinity to different kinds of philosophical views would never be completely forgotten. And it would also be used against him again in the 1970s, to which I will get in a bit. So having all this in mind, let's look at the revival that took place after 1956. It was not carried forward by Hrušovský. His interests basically shifted away from philosophy of science and epistemology to metaphysics. And I will not really mention Hrušovský again in the presentation because his other work is not directly relevant to philosophy of science, but it was his students that would carry the torch, so to speak, in the late 50s and in the 60s. And the main figure among them was Wojciech Filkorn. He earned his doctorate already in 1948 with a dissertation on many-valued logics. This dissertation was free of any references to Marxism-Leninism. Obviously, it was written before 1948. It did contain a lot of references to the Vienna Circle and also to the Lvov-Warsaw School. But in the 1950s, Filkorn's attention turns to methodology. So he produces this smaller book in 1956, which is called the Method of Science, or the Scientific Method. which would later be reworked and substantially extended into the work I've put on the slide, An Introduction to the Methodology of Sciences. And this was basically the second major book on the philosophy of science written in Slovak after Hrušovský's Teória vedy. The book, I mean, if we look at it from a contemporary point of view, it may not seem like a big deal, but the book at the time was very valuable. It centered on the explication of the concept of method, scientific method. It provides a sort of classification of methods which are employed across the sciences, both natural and social. And it puts forward an analysis of the logical structure of certain basic scientific procedures like defining or classification, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, etc. The general framework on which it is based basically derives from Hrušovský's Teória vedy. Filkorn also shares the inclination of his teachers to confirmationism and also views empirical knowledge as hypothetical. An important difference, of course, between this book and Hrušovský's earlier work would be that Filkorn works within the constraints of Marxist-Leninist requirements. So, of course, there are quotations of the classics. There are mentions of dialectics and dialectical logic. But honestly, the book is more technically rigorous than anything Hrušovský produced either before or after, because Filkorn had this background in more rigorous background in logic than Hrušovský. Compared from another point of view, if we look at what kinds of references are being made in the book, we would have to say that Hrušovský's early work, and especially Problems of Epistemology, was much more up-to-date for its time. So, I mean, by 1960, when An Introduction to the Methodology of Sciences comes out, the logical empiricist program was already being challenged by people like Quine or Goodman and others, and Filkorn does not engage with these challenges. Maybe he isn't even aware of them at the time yet. So both Filkorn's and other works that appear in the 1960s try to continue the legacy of Hrušovský, but without access to the most recent international debates. Maybe quite interesting within the V4 context is the fact that Polish works become featured much more prominently. And I think in 1956, Filkorn goes on this trip to the University of Warsaw, where he meets Ajdukiewicz, Kotarbiński, and others, and establishes some sort of an exchange. So the book served as this bridge between Hrušovský's foundational work from the 40s and the more technically sophisticated contributions that would also appear later on in the 1960s. So this was the function of the book. The importance of Filkorn as a person also lies elsewhere. He served as an important institutional bridge. He was starting from 48, he was a teacher at the philosophy department, and he managed to, in a few years, to attract a group of young students who quickly started their own careers in research and teaching, some of them already before they even graduated. So these were people like Augustin Ryška or Pavel Cmorej, Jan Šefránek or Josef Viceník, some of whom I will mention later, and their works, who basically became part of the newly established Department of Logic, which was established in 1962. This photo, however, is from the 1970s. So some other people also appear here, and not all of those that I mentioned would appear here. But under Filkorn's leadership, this department started to produce research. It was also involved in teaching both logic and philosophy of science or methodology of science at the Faculty of Arts here at Comenius University. So the The revival in the 1960s produced a number of works, some of them journal papers, some of them manuscripts or hard to get articles in various collections. But I think these three are the most important. They are all books, as you can see. I will start with the one in the center. That's a book by Hrušovský, which is called Chapters in the Theory of Science. And it's basically nothing new, right? It's a collection of a selection of excerpts from Hrušovský's earlier work. So even though his interests have moved away from philosophy of science, the late 1960s allowed for at least a belated reception of this early work, which for between 48 and 68 was not easy to access, known mostly to specialists and very rarely referenced. So it contains excerpts from both the theory of science and problems of epistemology. And it was through this book that most of the upcoming generation of philosophers became acquainted with Hrušovský's early work. So this new generation of younger philosophers like Rizka, Cmorej, and Šefránek, they would focus primarily on logic and semantics. However, some of the work that they produced in the 60s does contain some contributions to philosophy of science as well. So Rizka's book on the left basically applies the apparatus of what he calls formal methodology and formal logic to philosophy itself, and treats philosophy as an object susceptible to methodological investigations. So it's the first attempt in Slovak at a metaphilosophy. So insofar as methodology of science would include the humanities, which at least on the standard usage of the term Veda in Slovak, it mostly would. We can view Rizka's work as a contribution also to a methodology of science broadly conceived. It basically follows in Filkorn's footsteps in providing first a general idea of what methods are, and then investigates the application of certain methods in philosophical investigations. The book by Šefránek from 1969 is conceived as an introduction to analytical theory of knowledge. So it also has broader ambitions than just being a contribution to philosophy of science. But its third part is most directly relevant to philosophy of science, develops certain motives from Hrušovský. So Šefránek very extensively engages with Popper, Carnap, Hempel, but also Hintika and Quine. So he comes to a position which he calls moderate empiricism, which he defends. So he views science as basically having an empirical base, which consists of singular statements, which are intersubjectively controllable, not just like private sensory reports, but intersubjectively controllable statements. Theories are tested holistically as wholes, not proposition after proposition, and verification is always approximate and probabilistic. So very broadly, a continuation of the Hrušovský program. The difference is that Šefránek also draws on a generation of literature that came after Hrušovský. So, as I mentioned, Hintika's inductive logic, Carnap's probability theory, Popper's falsificationism, the critique of the analytic synthetic distinction, etc. So again, it's sort of like an update that tried to close the gap that emerged between 48 when Hrušovský put out his problems of epistemology, and 68 when this renaissance of philosophy of science in Slovakia arrives at its peak. I would say that what makes these works from the end of this peak most interesting, and this applies to both Hruška and Šefranek, is that what I would call the level of emancipation that they achieved from the dominant framework. So they make no concessions to Marxism-Leninism. Hruška very clearly distances himself from dialectical logic, and he says, okay, let's leave that to other experts. I will speak about formal logic, as it was called, and formal methodology. And Šefranek starts the book with an epigraph, with like a starting slogan taken from Popper. And he doesn't cite a single Soviet author in the book. So this is a good indicator of how far they were able to go at the end of the 60s. But of course, these favorable conditions, for well-known reasons, came to an end. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact armies in 68, okay, it took maybe 2 or 3 years for the dust to settle, but basically the philosophy of science and analytically inclined philosophy in general emerged substantially weakened from the process. So Hruška decided not to return from a fellowship in the US and emigrated and continued his career there. Cmorey was moved to a non-teaching position, unable to publish. Šefranek was completely banned from academia, had to find other work. And by the mid-70s, Hrušovský was again targeted in a campaign, this time not because of his positivism, but because of his affinities with literary and philosophical structuralism. So for those who stayed, conditions of work changed completely. While in the 60s, as we've seen, you were able to basically publish books or papers with hardly any references to the classics, or even work which openly professed a different approach. In the 70s, atmosphere of anti-revisionism, etc., this was basically impossible. So they got into all of this trouble, some of them because of their views on the occupation, some of them because of their involvement in the reform process or in some protest against the occupation, like a written protest, for example, or simply because of the perceived lack of political reliability. Like I said, Šefranek was completely banned from academic life, and he worked at various institutes of applied research outside of academia, unable to publish, and his focus changed to computer science. He did work on knowledge representation and early artificial intelligence. By the way, the book from 69, Logika, jazyk a poznanie, logic, language, and knowledge, was supposed to have been his dissertation, but he could only defend it in 1991 after the Velvet Revolution. I mean, some of these 1960s researchers remained in employment at the university or elsewhere. I have not mentioned everyone who was involved in the revival, but the conditions for doing any sort of substantial work in philosophy of science were now very different. Of note is work that continued primarily through three thinkers, Filkorn, Václav Černík, and Josef Vicissitudes, who were all employed at the Department of Logic at the time. Filkorn, the teacher of this generation, along with Hrušovský, continued to produce some work in the philosophy and methodology of science, but he mostly concentrated on refinements of his earlier contributions, or also taking positions in debates that were largely of historical significance at the time. So he would write on the debates between inductivism and deductivism, or Carnap versus Popper, But his work would mostly be focused on ideas or problems that he had already covered in earlier stuff. A contribution that became quite prominent in the 1970s for reasons which I will briefly explain was due to Václav Černík. I have previously written something about him in Slovak. So just very briefly, Černík saw his work very self-consciously as part of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. He narrowly avoided repression after '68. He was also, thanks to Wojciech Filkorn's intervention, able to continue work. His work, although it is firmly within philosophy of science, is not of the analytic philosophy of science kind, but an interesting thing to mention in the V4 context would be that it was Černík who introduced the so-called Poznan school of idealizational philosophy of science to the Slovak context. And he also tried to extend the approach and provide like a critical extension of it, I guess. And because Novak and others in Poland responsible for this tendency in the philosophy of science offered a kind of Marxist or Marxian approach to the philosophy of science using more modern tools, which were taken from analytic approaches. Černík's work represented a sort of an acceptable way of approaching problems of explanation or other themes from the philosophy of science in the very limited space of the 1970s. So this I would probably pick as the most important book of the 1970s. And slowly and surely, before I make some concluding remarks, we are moving to the final work, which is due to Josef Vicissitudes, and it's called The Debates on the Nature of Methodology of Sciences. Nominally, it's a contribution to Marxist-Leninist methodology, but if you look at the table of contents, this sort of official methodology occupies a very limited space in the book. The main emphasis, the main focus of the book is basically a systematic exposition of Western philosophy of science from logical empiricism through Popper's falsificationism to post-positivism. So Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend, also including the Poznan school. So clearly there's so this came out in 1988. Clearly there's a lag. Certain contributions that were made in the West in the late 70s or early 80s are missing, right? So the realism and anti-realism debate is not there. New directions in explanation, like the causal model or Nancy Cartwright's writings on idealization, or some newer theories of scientific progress like Larry Lawden. This is not represented in the book, or the semantic view of theories. But still, despite this lag, the book was an important attempt at bridging the gap. And it kept playing some role also after '89. It was then replaced by Vicissitudes' own contributions that were published after '89, either as journal papers or books. So anyway, I've spoken a lot about history and went into some detail about the content of these contributions. I would now like to try to summarize it for you and point out certain common aspects. So the early Hrušovský in his two major works was basically able to catch up to the Vienna Circle within about 5 years, and then he moved by 1948 more or less in lockstep with developments that were current at the time. So even though, for example, World War II, of course, was a huge disruption, he spent the Second World War as a librarian in the university library. He was determined to make up for this, and as early as 1946, he's publishing a review of A.J. Ayer's The Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, which only came out in 1940. So then in problemi noetiky, or problems of epistemology, he's able to provide, again, a very informed overview of the current state of the game, right? Then the situation changes and the lag extends. During the 1960s, as there is this loosening of screws or a thaw, there was again increased contact between local and international discussions, which was also possible thanks to newly translated work, especially Czech translations of major works by Carnap or Hempel and others, which became available for the first time to a wider audience. Then during normalization, the leg returned again. So any kind of sustained conversation with Western philosophy became more difficult, irregular, and also depended on the availability of the work, right? So again, within a V4 context, Polish translations of certain works played an important role because certain works were available in Polish translations and were otherwise not accessible. So the older colleagues would recount how every few weeks, or maybe it was once a month, I'm not sure, they would line up in front of the Polska Kniha, which was the Polish bookstore, to check out the new arrivals. And they usually contain some new books on logic or philosophy of science, either by Polish authors or Polish translations of Western authors. Anyway, these constant ruptures meant that throughout the history of philosophy of science in Slovakia, there would be a number of false starts, right? So at several points after Hrušovský's Teória vedy, it was necessary to start as if from the beginning. So Filkorn does this, and the late 1960s generation also does this, and then Vicissitudes basically does it again, catching up to the international discussion, hoping that in the near future conditions will be favorable for some further development. So the works that I've mentioned here often begin by basically restating the foundations, which in the meantime would be forgotten and also have to be updated with new developments that occurred in the meantime. Still, I would say that despite these constant ruptures, one can identify certain central motives which form a sort of legacy started by Hrušovský and then developed by the next generations. Hrušovský from the beginning emphasized the logical analysis of the language of science and basically excluded the psychology of invention from its scope, rejected metaphysics as pseudo-problems in his philosophy of science work. Similarly, Filkorn defines methodology as the logical analysis of scientific procedures, not as a psychology of research. And this anti-psychological orientation toward the logical reconstruction of science is present also in the works by Ryška and Šefránek and Vicissitudes. Secondly, fallibilism. Already by 1938, Hrušovský argues that empirical propositions cannot be verified with absolute certainty. That confirmation, or as he calls it, verification, only yields degrees of probability, etc. All the next generations, Filkorn and the others, retain this framework. And finally, what Hrušovský called exactness basically is used in two senses. Philosophy, or scientific philosophy, as he said, was a discipline which should also avail itself of these new instruments produced by modern logic to secure certainty, to secure exactness in expressions. And also, this is an important criterion for early Hrušovský to apply to empirical science. This is the standard that we should expect, and it is philosophy of science's job to reconstruct empirical theories using these instruments provided by logic. and hold empirical science to this high standard. Maybe one feature to add to this that also appears to be represented across these generations and also plays some role today is the openness of philosophy of science towards social science and the humanities. So a kind of moderate methodological naturalism in that certain methods are common to all disciplines, and the instruments of philosophy of science can also be applied to social science and the humanities. Again, something which is already present in the manifesto of the Association for Scientific Synthesis that Hrušovský helped establish. So thank you for your attention. I will finish my talk by directing your attention at this collage that was published in the same collection of poems and articles in which Hrušovský's article on Carnap appears from 1938. It is by Rudolf Fabry, also not just a visual artist, but a famous, important Slovak surrealist poet. I really like this combination, the strange combination of surrealism and logical empiricism in the history of Slovak philosophy. I wasn't really aware of it until recently. So again, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions or respond to your comments.
Thank you very much, Juraj, for your talk. For me, it was very, very interesting and informative. So now follows, of course, a section for questions and answers. So if you have a question, please click on the hand icon, and in this way you can request to speak. So the first is Susanna, please.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I'd like to ask you whether you mentioned some connections to Czech philosophers, but if there were some other connections during the development between Slovak philosophers that focus on methodology of science and Czech philosophers, even though I'm aware that there were not many of them, especially during Marxism-Leninism. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Focusing only on the 48 to 89 period, I think there were quite intense contacts between the Department of Logic and Methodology here in Bratislava and either the logicians at the Institute at the Academy or logicians at the Charles University Department. I think most of these contacts concerned logic, not as much philosophy of science. But there were some interesting exchanges. For example, there was a Slovak-born philosopher of science working in Prague and writing in Czech called Ivan Kuchar, who had in the 1960s a debate with, I think it was Jan Šefránek, or maybe it was Cmore, I'm not quite sure, about the proper way of doing philosophy of science. Šefránek, I guess, was defending a logical reconstructionist approach to empirical science, and Kuchar was defending an alternative approach. And of course, certain works of Czech philosophy or methodology of science by Tondl or Berka were very prominently featured in various works produced by Slovak philosophers of science. So I think there was quite intense exchange. It's not really something that I have focused on when looking at these writings, because I sort of took it for granted that since we were a part of the same, a single country, also a lot of common conferences, etc., there would have been intellectual exchange between Bratislava and Prague, or Bratislava and other cities in the Czech part of Czechoslovakia.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question has Tadeusz, so please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yes, thank you. That was a really nice overview, and I learned a lot. So thank you for the lecture. So I have one question, a small one, because I got curious about that when I was listening to you. So you mentioned that Hrušovský at some point made the distinction between two notions of confirmation, syntactic and semantic one. Right. Could you say a bit more on that distinction? What does this distinction amount to, and what is behind it? I'd love to know that. Thank you very much.
Okay. So the way I understand it is that Hrušovský is basically saying, okay, we have a certain statement that we are curious about. We want to find out whether it should be made part of the existing framework or not. We can check it in two ways. We can check it for, or we can verify it syntactically or confirm it syntactically by seeing whether it fits together with the assumed theoretical framework that is currently operative in the given discipline. And we should also check it against the facts, so to speak. So do an empirical test of the statement. So obviously, it's not. I mean, the terminology that Hrušovský uses is somewhat idiosyncratic. We wouldn't necessarily call the first kind of confirmation a type of confirmation, but it's the terminology that he uses. Was that clear?
Yes, thank you. So it's just a brief comment, kind of, because that sounds interesting. Because if you put that in this manner, that looks like if the idea of confirmation was a bit like a counterpart of the distinction in the theories of truth, right? Between, well, coherentist and correspondence theories of truth. So that looks like a confirmation counterpart of that approach. But I'm not sure if that was the inspiration or the relation between the two. Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't think of that, but it does make sense when you put it that way.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you very much. So if there are any questions, yes, Nikolai Tarabanov has a question. Please, Nikolai.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. So and it was very helpful to know about Slovakian philosophy of science tradition, and I'm interested in Jan Šifranik's book. So I've never heard about it before. So, and his book title, I mean, this Logic, Language, and Knowledge, resembles very much AG's Language, Truth, and Logic. Yeah. So, and also you mentioned that Hrušovský translated as another book, Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, if I'm right. Yeah. So my question is about this correlation between these two books. So do you know about, is it just coincidence? I mean, this title, two titles are very familiar. Or do you know whether Šifranik cited or not? And especially his project, Elimination of Metaphysics. Yeah, and one more question, if I may. So also you mentioned that Šifranik was banned from academia. So I'm just interested in reasons why. So why was he banned from academia? Because I found his Google Scholar profile, and he, as you said, that his research interest changed, and in the field of logic, programming, computational logic. politics? Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. I will address the first one first. So Hrušovský did not translate Ayer, but he wrote a review of that 1940 work. He also met Ayer personally. I'm not quite sure if it was 46 or 47. He traveled to the UK and met Ayer personally. And as regards the title of Šéfránek's book, yeah, I think it's a very direct inspiration. In fact, he also Language, Truth and Logic by Ayer also appears in the bibliography of the book. So I think that's a very obvious reference to Ayer's book, and I think yeah, both Šéfránek and Ríška were very much inspired by Anglophone or Anglo-American analytic philosophy. And had they been able to develop it, I'm sure they would have developed this approach. After all, Cmorey as well is a good example of this. So Pavel Cmorey was also not able to publish anything between 1970 and I think 1985, when slowly the situation began to improve. But after 89, there was an explosion of his publications. So he published a lot of papers and also a number of books. He also helped found the first Slovak analytic philosophy journal, Organon F. So I'm sure there would have been at least as much activity by this generation in the 1970s period if they had been allowed to. To your question about Šéfránek, why was he banned? I think, I mean, I don't know all the details of. I mean, there was this process of vetting of party members and also other people involved in education and finding out their position on the occupation, etc. And I don't know about all of the factors that came into the calculation, so to speak. But in Šéfránek's case, a very important factor would have been an article that he wrote for a student newspaper, I think in '69, which was called "The Spirit of Totalitarianism." It's Duch Totality in Slovak. You can. It was published after 1989 in one of the journals. I'm not sure if it was in Filozofia or in Organon F, but you can find it in Slovak. And it's a very clearly expressed protest against the oncoming period. So I think that was a very important reason why he was not allowed to continue in academia. And was there another question? I'm not quite sure if I have covered everything.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure if there are any more questions, because I don't see any hands. Okay, so I think it's time to thank again, Juraj. Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you all for your discussion, and thank you for joining us online. And have a nice rest of the day. That's all for me. So thank you all once again.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.